So, as Leanna said, I'm going to be talking about lessons learned and opportunities gained. And I thought today would be at this time is probably a really good time to look back and reflect on what's happened and then to see where we've been and then look at where we are right now and where we have the potential to be. So that's where I think the greatest opportunity lies. I do want to send out love and support for teachers. I know it's been really challenging, especially for K-12 teachers this past year, and for parents, teachers who are parents, especially challenging. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate everything that you've done for our kids over the pandemic. Um, I am a proponent of online learning. That's not a secret. I've been doing it for a really long time, since the late 90s when I started teaching in our online graduate program. I even taught high schoolers in the Idaho online supplemental program when it began in 2006. I've researched it. I've been involved in standards development, in best practice research. I've trained teachers to do it. I even wrote a book about it. And as much as I love the technology, it's never really been about that. For me, it's always been about rethinking and re-envisioning how we do school and the role that technology plays in that process, probably just like a lot of you here today. So what I most wish for is that we all leave today with maybe a feeling of hope and possibility, that our shared experience during the pandemic will make a permanent and positive difference in how we move forward with our new normal. I think there's been a lot of really pretty remarkable changes that have happened despite the devastating loss and missed opportunities. So we're going to start by taking a look at where we've been, and I'm going to focus on three kind of primary areas. So first is how our access to technology has changed as a result of the pandemic, how remote teaching has shifted our focus to the learner, and then how the pandemic has impacted teacher preparation. So, how has access to technology changed as a result of the pandemic? And what have we learned? For one, it highlighted the extent of the digital divide. That's no secret, I think, to any of us here. And we had tremendous efforts to solve the problem, and really creative efforts, but there's still a significant group of students who don't have adequate access. And most of those we recognize are from underserved populations. And I think we're now pretty confident that there's going to be a significant learning loss that we'll need to deal with in the weeks and months ahead. But everything that's happened shine light on the value of alternative delivery methods, not only for emergency response, but as a viable option for some kids in some contexts. And I think technology is also the increased access has shifted the perception of the role of the teacher, and maybe slightly, but a shift nonetheless. So how has remote teaching impacted the learning process? When we shifted to remote learning, we tried to recreate the face-to-face classroom experience by making teachers conduct live lessons and students attend them as if we could substitute one modality of instruction for another. In some cases, we even asked teachers to teach both in person and online simultaneously. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of trial and error, and a lot of reliance on teachers to keep the ship afloat. So to just keep swimming, just keep swimming. The better news is that we realized we could overcome uncertainty. And Melissa and Emily demonstrated this with their research on tech adoption amidst uncertainty in their presentation yesterday, which I encourage you to see if there's a recording of that. We definitely learned the importance of engagement and motivation in the learning process. And the pandemic shifted our perspective on the health and well-being of our students and their families. So that was a huge positive. And I think there is maybe greater awareness that traditional structures may do more to support the institution than the learner, which is, I think, is a really important uh, awareness. And then how have teacher preparation programs been impacted? For one, it highlighted deficiencies in teacher preparation, which is something that those in my field have been advocating for some time. It was really challenging for some teachers to pivot to an instructional delivery method that relied heavily on technology. And I'm worried. I mean, I was worried. I've been worried all year. I've been working with teachers since last spring, and a lot of the burden has been put on them to a lot of responsibility for lesson delivery, attendance and truancy issues, and as well as taking care of their students' and families' mental health. We also asked them to adapt and create digital teaching materials and curriculum, and that's time that probably could have been better spent connecting with their students. Teachers have also reported confusion with the sheer number of technologies available to them and how they can integrate those into their current systems and processes. And in many cases, as the graphic indicates, 86% of teachers bore the responsibility for paying for the technology used in their classroom. However, we've seen an impact on teacher prep programs. The swift pivot forced many teacher preparation programs to rethink teacher placement. And in some cases, they were forced to place teachers in virtual classrooms. And then in addition to virtual field placements, we saw a greater interest in what makes effective online learning. And we've seen awareness that simply moving materials online doesn't constitute effective online teaching. And then more importantly, there seems to be a greater appreciation for and acceptance that teachers need preparation in these practices, which is, again, something we've been advocating for a long time. But maybe most importantly, it also forced all teachers, even teachers of teachers, to use technology in new ways, which I think is fascinating and fabulous. So that's it for my brief kind of overview of where we've been. What I'd like to do is have you try and share in this Slido. We're going to see if it works. So you can either go to slido.com and enter the code or scan the QR code on this page. And it's going to ask you a question. What has been your experience? I'm trying to read it in really small print. With remote online teaching in one word. And you can use 2 words if you need to. Let's see if it works. Oh, it's always trial and error. I'm giving you a minute to get your code into place. Oh no. I tried it yesterday. Is it working? Sorry about that cough. Okay, let's see. Yay, it's working. Cool. Circus. I love that. Frantic, utter panic. Yeah. Challenging. We can use this to vent. No interaction. Tiring. Yeah. Exhausting. Exciting. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Is there another link? It's slido.com and the code is Z200. Fattening. Okay, that's good. Uh, yeah. Oh, good. Thank you for explaining. Thanks so much. All right. And I'll post that somewhere. I don't know if there's a place for me to post it when it's finished, maybe in the discussion for after the keynote. So next, we're going to take a look at where we are. And so what I think is exciting about this is for the first time, it's not a question of if students have access to technology, if we focus on the learner, and if teachers are better prepared. We're now solidly in the age of when. So in terms of access to computers, 78% of K-12 households indicated they had computers for educational purposes, and 75% indicated they had internet access for educational purposes, which is huge. I mean, that's a huge number of families that actually have computers. And other estimates say that, and this, I'm going to read this because it's pretty complicated, 20 to 40% of the connectivity divide and 40 to 60% of the access to e-learning devices divide was closed by states and districts as a result of the pandemic. So we're arguably at the greatest level of technology access ever, which presents unprecedented opportunity for permanent change. And we're seeing some changes already, significant changes, especially in state policy and with the expansion of digital learning opportunities. So we've seen changes in full-time online learning eligibility requirements. We've seen changes in the removal of charter and virtual school enrollment caps. We've seen an expansion of parent and student choice legislation, and we've seen change in how schools, and particularly virtual schools, are funded, which is pretty exciting. There are potential improvements in other areas. So I'm sharing this slide just to kind of demonstrate I think the widespread acceptance and recognition for permanent change. Over 50% of parents surveyed by the National Parents Union want the option for in-person or remote learning into the 2021-2022 school year. And we're hearing chatter of retaining permanent online learning programs at the district and school level as well. There's also widespread recognition of the importance of designing resilient learning systems that are agile enough to quickly adapt during a crisis, whether or not a school adopts an online program. The potential for improved access to expert teachers has never been greater. So there's no longer a reason to let remoteness or state borders impede access to quality teachers or quality teacher preparation programs for that matter. And there's been a proliferation of quality content. Think Khan Academy, but others educational related organizations are coming online every day. And it doesn't only mean we have more access to materials, but we now have mainstream access to up-to-date materials through OER. And finally, we've had an unprecedented outreach from teachers and schools to parents and families, meaning we've set the bar really high for parent and family involvement in the future. So with greater access to technology and the combined shift to remote learning, we've made a potentially transformative shift in focus on the learner. So those of us in the online realm know that making connections and creating and building community online is paramount to student success. And we know that personalization and active engaged learning processes are the best motivators. It quickly became apparent to many teachers that live lectures on Zoom for 6 to 8 hours a day was not the most effective or efficient way to engage and motivate students. And this is my bias showing through. I think engagement gets very complicated when your audience is no longer captive and learning is no longer equated with 55-minute blocks of time. It's an entirely different animal. What is encouraging is that we're seeing increasing confidence in the use of technology supported learner centered practices. So teachers are leveraging technology to create individualized learning programs, to facilitate project-based learning, to help students practice new skills with adaptive learning software, to enable mastery-based learning, and to keep track of individual students' learning progress. And I realize that most of this is not new for us here, but what's outstanding is the progression to mainstream adoption. And we've also seen an abundance of efforts to address student social-emotional health. So districts like the Tulsa Public Schools created wellness teams whose sole responsibility was the health and well-being of their students. They were designed to meet technological needs, emotional needs, attendance needs, and even physical health needs. They also created care and connect centers that provided students with a physical space they could go to speak to an adult, for tech support, for one-on-one tutoring, and for counseling services. We know that students have reported any number of issues with distance learning, from feeling isolated and missing the normal routine of school to feeling disconnected from their learning. But it's not all bad news. Some students have done quite well with distance learning, and the lack of social pressure being one reason. Another has been having their voices heard for the first time in online discussions, because these are students who were afraid to speak up in class. The Institute for Family Studies found the mental health of teenagers actually stayed the same or improved last spring. And I'm going to say that again. They found that the mental health of teenagers actually stayed the same or improved last spring. And they think a possible reason why is because students got more sleep. They were able to engage in their online lessons at their own time. And then finally, the shift to learner-centered approaches. We can talk, oh my gosh, let me see. Oh, what happens when teachers are better prepared? Sorry about that. It's pandemic brain. What we know is that there's greater interest in permanent change. 59% of parents surveyed indicate they think schools should be focused on rethinking how we educate students. And I think this is a really important metric, because it does speak again about rethinking education and what that might look like. And a lot of it starts with teacher preparation. So the Christensen Institute reports that 79% of teachers that they surveyed discovered resources and practices they plan to keep using after the pandemic is over. I think, though, most critically, remote instruction provided us time to consider how the teacher guides the learning process when they're removed from the center of the room, which opens the door to greater application of learner-centered practices and for the appreciation of the value of flexibility in time, pace, place, and path of learning, which are elements in blended and online learning. So aside from greater tech access, the shift could be truly transformative moment. We also saw a greater use of shared resources and professional learning networks by teachers, and a greater recognition of the benefits of blended learning and sometimes online learning, sorry. And then finally, we have an amazing opportunity for the end of the closed door isolated classroom. It can be difficult to hide when everything is available to see in an LMS. And I'm a huge proponent of transparency in teaching. I think it makes us much better teachers. So I think it's really good to sit back and reflect and think about what we can learn from the mistakes that we've made. And we don't always know the right thing to do until we're faced with our inadequacies. I've seen a lot of ideas out there about how to move forward. Most say we need to take the opportunity to do better, that we can't go back to the way it was. And the good news is that we have many of the necessary elements already. We have unprecedented computer access, we have unprecedented focus on the learner, and we have teacher preparation and in-service PD that's targeted at technology-based approaches. So, what I'd like to ask you to do right now is to take a little journey with me. It's kind of a thought experience. For me, it was a real challenge to think through how we can make change permanent, given that we've tried so many things before and nothing has ever stuck. And so maybe it's looking at small beginnings. We've seen that there are opportunities, but what is it going to take for permanent change? And I got to thinking about making things stick in small beginnings, and it reminded me of Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, and his stickiness theory. And so I went back to that to see if he could offer some guidance on what we should be doing. What I found ironic was that Gladwell suggests the best way to understand grand cultural and societal changes is to think of them as epidemics. So I thought that was pretty funny. So the question is, are we at the tipping point? Have we changed enough to keep the momentum going? And according to Gladwell, even very small, seemingly insignificant changes can create huge societal change. Something as simple as washing graffiti off of subway cars in New York City fundamentally decreased the occurrence of crime on the subways. And what might that look like in education? So if you think about it, the simple act of using recorded lectures can change the balance of one-on-one time with the teacher in a traditional classroom. That simple act can change the balance of how time is used. More teachers than ever are using an LMS to streamline homework submission and grading. Is the permanent use of online discussions far behind? Remote instruction and the elimination of time as a measure of learning may have contributed to the shift in the focus on the learner. Gladwell suggests that there are 3 primary lessons to be learned from tipping points. The first is to concentrate your resources in a few key areas and to be strategic and intentional. The second is to tinker and test. And just remember the New York City subway story. Changing one thing, the graffiti, ended up changing the outcomes in significant and substantial ways. And then finally, find your mavens and treat them well. They're the innovators, the visionaries, the soothsayers. They know more about what's going on and what's coming than anyone else. And I think the images are probably giving away my extreme nerdiness. So if we look at concentrating resources on a few key areas, I decided to look at access, learning loss, and teachers. And we're so close to providing every student access to technology. Now it's really just a matter of maintaining our progress. We have to find ways to close that gap in access to devices and to the internet and to Wi-Fi. And there have actually been some really creative solutions, including using school buses as mobile hotspots, extending Wi-Fi access outside the walls of the school, districts paying for computers and in-home Wi-Fi themselves, even creating homegrown broadband networks. They've done that in Utah, and using drones to deliver internet to students. In terms of addressing learning loss, there are lots of reports out there about the amount of learning loss that occurred in multiple subject areas, but in particular math and reading. What's really concerning is it's estimated that 3 million students will have had no formal instructions since last March. So Sal Khan is calling it disaster recovery. I just watched a video of him yesterday, that our next actions are going to be like disaster recovery. So how can we help students get back on track? And there are traditional methods, the holding students back, summer school remediation, but there are a few voices, including David Stein from the Fordham Institute, with empirical evidence that supports something called acceleration over remediation, meaning they cover past skills in the context of current skills. And the strategy itself includes lowering the number of targets to a body of crucial knowledge to be learned. In other words, less breadth and more depth, but not lowering the rigor. Other options include investing heavily in tutoring. Yes, I see that in the chat. The most recent CARES funding package includes support for tutoring specifically, but we can also think creatively about this as well. So how might we leverage school staff, including bus drivers, paraprofessionals, even students who can be peer tutors and mentors? And then how can we leverage technology to offer virtual labs and tutoring services to make it more accessible to students and families? And then teachers. So give every K-12 student access to a quality teacher. That to me is paramount. And that involves rethinking teacher prep for one. So allowing online field placements and creating long-term professional developments support to keep the gains that have been made. It also includes finding innovative ways to deploy teachers. So combining teachers in ways that they each teach their best subjects. Yeah, so that's a tough one. I know in online programs, one of the ways they support students and families is by assigning teachers to families instead of single students. So that's just one kind of creative way of looking at how teachers are deployed. And then identify ways in which to better support teachers before going forward with permanent blended and online learning options. And by this, I'm talking about reallocating resources to create an infrastructure that supports their primary role, which is connecting with students. So addressing attendance issues, curriculum development, grading, and content creation. And then to tinker and test. And tinker and test has to do with both context and message used to change behavior. So the context is the environment in which the behavior is occurring, and the message is what creates the stickiness. So it's said in such a way or done in such a way that it changes behavior. So I'm thinking begin by asking questions. So a simple question, how can we eliminate a textbook, changes the whole conversation and has the potential to create a huge change from physical textbook use to OER use. How can we make assignments that are more meaningful and relevant? How can we better support families? How can we measure student and teacher learning in a way that's more authentic to the learning process? The Christensen Institute offers some really good insight into moving forward with incremental changes while still keeping the momentum going for large-scale reform. They recommend districts who created virtual schools during the pandemic keep those as pockets of innovation and experimentation, while at the same time adopting just some elements or practices for mainstream classrooms, such as using an LMS or using open source content. Experiment with social emotional learning supports like wellness teams and Care and Connect centers that were implemented in Tulsa. Student health and well-being is going to be important after the pandemic, especially during disaster recovery. I also think technology can be used to maximize family engagement. So parent-teacher conferences conducted virtually, it opens the door for busy working families and single parents to be more participatory in their child's school and learning. And then revisiting how students demonstrate learning achievement can happen in the classroom with more focus on mastery learning, But small changes can also happen at the institutional level. In an effort to promote test optional processes, the University of Chicago is using mastery of calculus and statistics content on Khan Academy that's verified in part by how well a student can tutor another student as evidence for college admissions. So it's actually killing two birds with one stone. So it's showed the mastery and the tutoring of and mentoring of other students. I have a whole list of other incremental changes. I'll try not to list them all, but some ideas are experimenting with time. So making learning the primary target, regardless of the amount of time it takes, reorganizing schools and classrooms into more flexible learning centers, even just experimenting in classrooms with that. Virtual programs that already exist have done merged grade levels or eliminated them completely. And like I said before, assign teachers to families, delay start times, and use technology to support that. So maybe offering students the option to take an online course for their first class, and then they can complete that work on their own time and get more sleep. Use mentors and instructional tech coaches, of course. And let me see what else I have. Oh, experiment in the classroom with student-driven curriculum, a co-created schedule, and even student-made video lectures instead of teacher lectures. And then finally, leverage the rich data that's available through the use of technology. Simple learning analytic tools are built into every LMS, and they're informative at the administrative level. They're informative at the classroom level to help inform practice and instruction. And they're informative at the student level for self-regulation. So even teaching students how to use their LMS learning analytic dashboard can be helpful. They're effective in both online and blended classrooms. We all know about adaptive technologies and how they allow for immediate feedback and provide teachers with important information on progress. But I think that are going to be a lot more important as we move into disaster recovery in using teacher time efficiently, and then also providing that rich data to evaluate learner progress. And of course, I have to mention data mining because it's kind of my research thing right now. I do a lot of data mining. And what I find fascinating about it is that we're able to collect and analyze objective data of students' actual learning behaviors in the LMS. So we get it from the learning management server logs. It's still a little chunky. We don't have the amount of data that we'd like to have. Our algorithms are constantly being retested and reframed because of the changing school model or a change in a platform, but we're getting better all the time at being able to predict student outcomes. And we're at a point where we can do that about halfway in the semester, which gives us time to intervene and improve a learner's chance of success. And finally, to find your mavens. So mavens make change happen through information and ideas. These are the people you ask whenever you want to know something about anything. They're always the people in the know. They're the builders, the engineers, and in education, I would equate them to the makers, the risk takers, and more often than not, the techies. So a lot of you out there. So in addition to mavens, you need to look for connectors and salespeople too, people who know lots of other people and can make ideas stick. But what's really interesting is in terms of mavens, it doesn't just apply to individuals, it can apply to institutions as well. So look for states that already have successful online and blended programs in schools, as well as those schools in districts that transitioned more easily to remote learning. Find out what they did and how they did it. Look for what the Aurora Institute calls innovation zones. So 40% of states have innovation zones. They're districts or schools of innovation that have waivers from policies that create barriers to student-centered approaches. So borrow from the work that's already been done. Find teacher prep programs that not only employ, but model cutting edge approaches to educate 21st century teachers, and then reward your transformative teachers. Um, they need to be rewarded. There's a lot of tech focused teachers out there who support schools without any reward whatsoever. And that may mean creating new metrics for evaluating teacher performance. So that's a lot of information, I know, and I think we can't deny it's going to be really hard work. Technology is not a panacea. It can't motivate kids. It can't keep them engaged. It can't coach, mentor, or support them. But we need teachers for that. Technology can alter the learning experience by allowing us to provide flexibility. I keep coming back to this because it's so important in online and blended, in time, pace, place, and path of learning, to personalize the learning process and to even relieve some of those more tedious tasks. So I'm going to engage in a little bit of reflection here. I hope you'll let me. There is a point at the end of it. My grandmother was a teacher for 35 years. And some of my earliest memories of our playing teacher in a little sunroom off the main living areas of her house. She provided me with all the necessary things I needed, the attendance book, the lesson planning book, the worksheets, activities. I even went so far as to list names in alphabetical order of all my students and assign grades based on how well I thought they did on their imaginary assignments. And I learned all of this not from watching my grandmother formally teach. I never was in her classroom, but from my own experience of school. My experience with my grandmother was far removed from the formal process of teaching as I understood it. She taught me how to crochet, how to knit, how to sew. I'm going to age myself here, even to tat, if you know what tatting is. She taught me how to write poems and to flatten and dry leaves in the pages of magazines and books. She taught me where to find wild asparagus by searching for overgrown patches in the fall and marking the location on a map. She even let me drive her car on the dirt roads in the country. And I learned in all these processes to add and subtract, to measure and use fractions, to see patterns, to identify plants, to use a map, and even to drive. And I tell this story to illustrate the often stark difference between formal schooling as we've historically known and understood it, and forms of learning that rely on inquiry, interest, and even play. Our traditional forms of education come from a long cultural history of doing it the way it's always been done, because it suits an industrial model and because it's practical and easy to manage. And I think if we've learned anything during this crisis, it's that learning is not one size fits all. Structures like bell schedules, bus schedules, classroom walls, and even courses don't always serve the learner best. So what I hope is that our overall experiences with remote teaching have opened spaces for less teacher at the center of the room approaches. And where we can use technology to better support the learning process in ways that allow for more hands-on inquiry-based approaches that support the whole child, that engage learners, and that allow for interest and creativity to flourish. So this is the closest we've ever come to mainstream adoption of one-to-one computers. And if we remember that even the smallest change can have a significant impact, it's easy to see how something as simple as a recorded lecture can change the trajectory of the traditional school day. So I'll leave you with this. Let's maybe try something different. Let's think small and not let this opportunity go to waste. And I thank you so much for attending this. I'm going to put up my contact info. And I'm always open to speaking with you. If you email me, feel free to email me. I also included references to a lot of the things I talked about on this slideshow, so I'll share that as well.